Last Thursday, more than 100 people protesting the ongoing genocide in Gaza were removed from Columbia University's campus in New York City and arrested and charged with trespassing by the police. Students weren't just arrested, but suspended from Columbia and from Barnard College, ejected from university housing and smeared as anti-Semites. This is all pretty unprecedented. According to the Washington Post, it's the first time in nearly 30 years that university officials in the United States have brought in police to break up a campus protest. What was a peaceful campus protest? The actress and activist Cynthia Nixon tweeted on Friday, "As a Barnard College graduate, I'm shocked and ashamed that it and Columbia are violently crushing the right of students to peacefully protest. This is not who we are. Both schools must immediately reinstate these students and protect their right to fight for a free Palestine." I'm delighted to say that Cynthia is a contributor to Zeteo, and she joins me now. Cynthia, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's a shame it's under these circumstances, but it is a pleasure to have you on board. Let's dive right in. How horrified were you by what you saw at your alma mater, Columbia, last week?
I was really shocked, I have to tell you, Mehdi. I mean, when I chose to go to Barnard College, it was actually the year that I applied was the first year that they accepted women at Columbia. So I had a choice of going to either school. But I went to Barnard because of its incredible feminist history of when so many other women's schools were really focused on training women to be wives and hostesses. Barnard was a place where women who wanted careers, women who wanted to be part of the social conversation, people like Zora Neale Hurston and Margaret Mead, and more recently, Greta Gerwig, like real pioneers and trailblazers. And it's a place of a lot of great political thought. So I was really, really shocked both by Columbia University at large, but also my college, Barnard. This is, as I said in my tweet, this is really not who we are or what we should be doing to our students who are out there speaking their consciences and fighting for what they believe.
Yes. And what I find so depressing, Cynthia, is that the NYPD, the New York Police Department, who arrested those kids, said they were perfectly peaceful, they weren't doing anything threatening, and it was Columbia President Minouche Shafik, who was born in Egypt, by the way, who called in the cops and told them that these kids, peacefully protesting for Palestine, posed, and I quote, "a clear and present danger to the university." We now have a university administrator who's to the right of the NYPD.
Yes, and just to be clear, it wasn't just the generic NYPD that was called in. It was the Strategic Defense Group, I think they're called, which is like a more kind of a serious, when
Yes.
there's a more serious threat. And yes, as you say, the NYPD offered up of their own free will the fact that they kind of pushed back on the president's narrative, saying these students were doing nothing. They were sitting together, they were singing, they were eating, they were praying together, they were having conversations. They were on a part of the Columbia campus that is specifically prescribed for where protests should happen. They were not blocking anybody's access to any part of the campus, to classes or cafeteria or really anything else. And if you believe in democracy, you have to believe in protest. You really can't have one without the other. And it's really noteworthy too. I mean, so many colleges, my own college and university included, we're so proud of our activists, after the fact. We talk with
Yes.
great pride about the '68 protests and Columbia and
So
all the good that came out of that. Columbia touts very proudly that they were the first Ivy League to divest from South Africa. But when these peaceful protesters are doing their God-given right and ostensibly what their universities are teaching them to do, are telling them
Yes.
that it's good, or telling them that acting like their heroes in the past have done, we have cracked down on them horribly. We've arrested them. We've thrown them out of school. We've seized their belongings. We've barred them from campus. We've essentially, made them homeless in New York City. And, why?
So
Why?
it's a great question. Cynthia, the argument against campus protests is that Jewish students feel unsafe, threatened, that anti-Semitism is on the rise, and it is, but there is a danger here of conflating anti-Jewish rhetoric, which is always unacceptable, with anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist rhetoric, is there not?
Yes, I mean, when October 7th happened, I burst into tears as soon as I heard. I was devastated about the Israelis that had been killed, the Israelis that had been taken hostage, but I was also weeping because I knew what would come. And we spoke out, my wife and I, because it seemed so devastating, but also because we had been contacted by our oldest son, who lives in Chicago, who is two of my three children are Jewish, and my oldest son really ardently so. He's very active in his temple. He's a very very active member of Jewish Voices for Peace in the Chicago chapter. He's been arrested since this all started. He's written numerous articles and made speeches, and he really said to us, please, you have a big megaphone, please speak out. We all have to do whatever we can to stop this slaughter and starvation of civilians, unarmed civilians, 70% of whom are children and women. And for my son, it's particularly painful because his grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And so for him, he always says, because of that experience, because he's a student of the Holocaust, he knows that never again means never again for anyone, and that it is his responsibility as a Jew whose family has experienced this firsthand to make sure that any place this is happening in the world, that he does everything he can to stop it.
And you've been very bold since October the 7th in speaking out. And I use the word bold because you're in an industry, in Hollywood, in the entertainment industry, where a lot of your peers have not spoken out on this issue. And I wonder why that is, Cynthia. Is it that your fellow actors and directors are just too afraid to speak out, afraid about being called anti-Semitic, or losing a role, losing work, losing at an awards ceremony? Is there a climate of fear, of censorship, dare I ask, in Hollywood on this issue of Gaza?
There is 100% a climate of fear. And, we look what's happening at not just at Columbia, but at universities across the country, and what's happening when the presidents come and try and testify in Congress. But absolutely, it's very, just to quote my son, he said, anti-Semitism is such a terrible threat, and it's a rising threat. And it's particularly painful to him to hear it, to quote him, tossed around like a political football by warmongers. And I think that we do, anti-Semitism is something we all need to take really seriously and do everything we can to fight. And to have this distraction to say the anti-Semites are actors who speak out to try and stop the slaughter, are college students who say they don't want the university's money funding a war machine that's killing Palestinian civilians. This is not anti-Semitism. This is anti-war. And I think, when the president of Colombia was asked last week by, Congress, by Ilhan Omar, I believe, have there been, anti-Muslim protests, anti-Jewish protests, anti-Palestinian? She kept saying, no, no, no. And I think that when we actually look at, a number of students were doxxed, had their faces put on trucks that were rolled around saying, and leading
in Colombia, they were hit with skunk spray. Which Colombia didn't investigate until journalists put pressure on them. I mean, the college situation is bad. I'm just fascinated by the idea of the industry that you're part of, which has always been known to stand up for liberal causes, lefty causes, stood up against Trump. And then there's a genocide in Gaza. Not only is there silence, but when people at the Oscars wear pins or give a speech calling it out, they're immediately attacked as anti-Semites.
Yes. And I mean, I do think, I am part of an Artists for Ceasefire letter that over 400 of us have signed, Kate Blanchett and Selena Gomez and Mark Ruffalo, so many people. But I do think that, and I wear my pin, I wear my scarf, I speak about it whenever I can. But yes, I think there is both a lot of fear among big names that we know from speaking out. But I think what's also true that's happening more under the radar is so many young artists, particularly young artists of color, are just quietly being let go by their agencies.
Yes.
And it's really terrible, and that's really happening. We all know about Susan Sarandon, but I think this is really happening under the radar.
It's a very good point. Just before we finish, you ran for the Democratic Party's gubernatorial nomination in New York in 2018 against Andrew Cuomo. We all remember him. At the weekend, 37 Democrats voted against sending Israel more weapons to use in Gaza, where they've already been used to kill something like 14,000 Palestinian kids in 6 months. But the majority of the House Democratic caucus did vote in favor of more weapons for Israel. That is pretty shameful, is it not, from the elected Democratic Party?
I think it's completely shameful. And I think, this is a time when you look, and it's been pretty consistent, really, ever since the siege in Gaza started. 70% of Americans, a majority of Americans of whatever political party, but 70% of Americans across the board believe there needs to be a ceasefire now. And I think our elected officials, including and right up to, and perhaps most importantly, the president, do a great disservice to our country, to the people of Gaza, to our country's standing in the world, to Joe Biden's, opportunity to get reelected, when he does not listen to the vast majority of Americans and what they want and what they believe.
I think it's about 70% of Democrats, but it is a majority of Americans consistently have supported a ceasefire. You're right. You mentioned Joe Biden. Last question. If Joe Biden called you right now, Cynthia, what would you say to him?
I would say that you are a man who has experienced such terrible, terrible loss in your life. And one of the things that I think made people vote for you as president is your incredible empathy and ability to reach across and feel people's pain and want to take it away. I don't understand how surely you have seen the footage that we have all seen. Surely you've seen people live streaming their horror from the rubble. How can you not? You, of all the people on the have the ability to make this stop. Why aren't you?
Well said. We will have to leave it there. Cynthia Nixon, thank you so much for coming on board with Zeteo. We're honoured, delighted to have you, and thank you for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mehdi. It's good to talk to you.